Ambassador Amar, who was India's former envoy to Afghanistan. He's a member of the National Security Advisory Board. He has participated in some of the conferences which have been held on Afghanistan in various places. Very active on Afghanistan, and frankly, our go-to man in many ways on things Afghanistan. We have Ibraheem Bahiss, who is a scholar who's done a lot of work on the current situation in Afghanistan and how the international configurations are working out there. And we will really profit hearing from him. Kabir is, of course, our resident expert on all things depressing like terrorism, etc. But he is also an expert on West Asia, has done a lot of work on Iran, on of course terrorism, of course, is his pet subject. If there was no ISIS, I think Kabir would really feel quite depressed. So he's one of those people who thrives on stuff like this. We have Kriti, a very good scholar on Pakistan, somebody to watch out for in the future. There's nothing that she doesn't know about Pakistan, so we're lucky to have her today. And finally, Kalpit, who is a bit of a China wonk, if I might use that term. And he will give us a perspective today on how, not all the great powers, but at least the Chinese factor on how that is likely to operate as far as Afghanistan is concerned. Now, before the way we will go about it is, I'll just make a few introductory remarks, then hand over the floor to Ambassador Sinha, who I will request him to speak about these various international forums and players who are becoming active in this so-called, I can only say so-called peace process. I am kind of skeptical about this peace process, but I'll request him to speak on that, and then we'll go to Ibraheem, who will speak about what the situation is inside Afghanistan. Kabir, of course, will speak about the international terror groups which are operating out there, and he will speak about the Iranian role in Afghanistan. Of course, when I say he will speak about that, he's free to speak about anything else that he wants to. Kriti will, of course, be speaking about her favorite country, which is Pakistan, and along with it, its links with the Taliban, how the Taliban are likely to behave going forward, and how she sees things unfold. And finally, Kalpit, who will give us some insights onto what the discourse is inside China on what is happening in Afghanistan. But and once the panelists finish their presentations, what we'll do is we will open up for Q&A. So whatever questions you have, you can direct them to any specific person, or you can just leave them hanging, and I'll out the questions to whoever I think will be able to answer them best. But before I hand over the floor to Ambassador Sinha, just a couple of things. So my skepticism about the peace process notwithstanding, frankly, I don't see why the Taliban are likely to give in to any of the demands which are being made by the international community, or the requests which are being made by the international community at this point in time. I also don't see any reason why the Pakistanis, having done everything they could do to make the Taliban, to revive the Taliban movement, to make them come into the kind of position they've come in, why at this late stage they will want to back off and try and reform the Taliban or moderate their positions, assuming that they can do so, and perhaps Kriti will give us greater insights on that. So my skepticism aside, the fact of the matter remains that everybody would want to have a stable Afghanistan, because an unstable Afghanistan will actually spread instability throughout the region. In India itself, we have seen that ever since Afghanistan was destabilized way back in the late 1970s, things like terrorism, which were quite alien to the Indian subcontinent, have become a normal kind of a thing out here. We've seen all sorts of other instabilities come into India. So we are not going to remain untouched, as of course are neither going to be the other countries in the region and beyond. We've seen that what happens in Afghanistan also has repercussions in the US, it has repercussions around the world. So Afghanistan clearly is a very, very important country, and stability in Afghanistan is very important to everybody. Unfortunately, the number of players involved, uh, and the number of interests, competing interests involved, seem to militate against the possibility of some kind of a stability coming back to Afghanistan anytime soon, unless, of course, it's the kind of stability which nobody wants. Uh, but that is again a problem, because everybody says that they don't want the Taliban to come back or have complete power, but nobody is really
Have you lost Sushant on the feed?
His, his voice is not there now.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's give him a few seconds. Otherwise, I'll take over. Okay, I think we've lost Sushant's feed, so I'll just quickly take over from where he left. So I think he was just sort of offering a platform on what our discussions are going to be based today. So current situation in Afghanistan, how multiple cogs are both international and regional moving around, of how the future of Afghanistan after the American withdrawal will look like. The American withdrawal is well under its way. I think it surprised a whole bunch of us at the speed at which it has been going on, including leaving historical bases such as Bagram and stuff like that. So just moving forward from where Sushant left, if I can just ask Ambassador Sinha, who's with us today, to just give us a sort of his view on how he sees this situation developing, specifically with multiple discussions taking place. Doha was something that a lot of these changes or decision making happened. We've seen Turkey conference trying to be built up, but if you see Taliban statement yesterday, they have put a lot of spears in the way of that conference. So just a quick overview of what you think is going to happen in the next couple of months now.
Thank you. How much time do I have?
You can take 10 minutes.
5 minutes? 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Well, let me start by complimenting all of you who have done this wonderful report. I read it actually twice over. All the chapters, you have covered everything. I see that the chapter on India is missing, but I guess you have mentioned that India has been an outlier in a sense that uh, we have stood behind the Afghan government, the Afghan public opinion, more so to say. And one thing in the report where it says that India is supporting Ghani, there I think we need to clarify that India is not supporting particular leader X or Y. What it is supporting is the system, the Republican system, and which is what is the predominant wish of the Afghan people. But coming back, of course, I have made comments on all the different aspects, but that we'll discuss once the authors come up. But let me tell you, from war to peace, unfortunately, is never a straight line. No, end of war does not necessarily translate into peace as far as Afghanistan is concerned, or perhaps anywhere else. Uh, Peace will come out of a process of an intra-Afghan dialogue, which unfortunately, while Doha Agreement had laid the basic groundwork for, has not taken off. And I think Sushant referred to it. It has not taken off primarily, in my view, because of two reasons. One's that Taliban is not convinced that a military victory is not possible. So they have very little incentive to engage. And they also know that Americans are working on a timeline, and they are accelerating and they will leave. So they would like to wait out this process completely. Second, that the Afghan leadership within Kabul, and I think one of your report covers itself, is very divided. Uh, there is no one unified vision for plan. And third, the reconciliation looks difficult, because you see, when two warring factions have to come together, either they have to both agree that military victory is not possible, or so there is an element of tiredness and sort of inevitability of peace. Let's put it this way. And second, that they have certain basic common values that they share, or a common vision for moving forward. That seems to be missing. I know these are very diametrically opposite visions, and how that will be reconciled, it is still not clear to all of us. As far as Americans are concerned, I think it was a well-known position of President Biden, and he has taken obviously a conscious decision, because he has seen it all as vice president. He saw the surge of Obama, then he saw the timeline given by Obama, then of course setting up of the Doha office, then which did not then function for 5 years, its revival. Unfortunately, now what had happened, and of course, he also saw, by the way, both the role of Pakistan and the OBL operations in 2011, and the disastrous consequences of hasty withdrawal from Iraq. So he has obviously taken a conscious decision, but I must say that he was dealt a very bad hand by President Trump. He had no option. I know, with 2,500 people and a number of contractors and perhaps three times that number of NATO soldiers. So I think he has chosen the best of the worst possible positions. Of course, if the peace talks had begun, or at least there was an agreement on what the end state should be, it would have been more sensible. But anyway, that's a decision that has been taken, and the region has to live with it. I also agree with the proposition that you all have proposed, that this withdrawal does three things in my mind. First, in a way, it takes away the external factor which had both fractured the consensus on Afghanistan, the regional consensus, and had also acted as a catalyst or an incentive for this jihad to go on. So it has obviously implications for everybody. Everybody's policy, which was primarily initially, I thought, that was driven very much by anti-Americanism, will need to be recalibrated and start looking at something, because American withdrawal, what it does is it makes the issue more local and more regional. So there will be more responsibility on the neighbors and the region. How they play their cards is different. Of course, their activities over the last 2 years has given a certain amount of premature legitimacy to Taliban, which is also one of the reasons why they have been very, very sort of adamant in a way. We'll discuss the different positions, options of China, Russia, not Japan, but Pakistan, Iran. And we should keep in mind that the two countries which will be key are both Iran and Pakistan. And they have supported Taliban for different reasons, or different elements of Taliban for different reasons. Some of that may be calibrated. At least Iran will definitely feel that there are reasons that it will recalibrate its position, and it has been stated quite publicly after, I think, this report was finalized, when the Iranian foreign minister spoke at the Raisina. But Pakistan will also have to look, because it will also have serious implications. One thing which has not been discussed, and perhaps that could be the sequel of your report, is the implications on Taliban itself of the US withdrawal. You see, because Taliban, let's put it this way, that if the Doha agreement had been sort of rolled out the way it was supposed to be within the timelines, Taliban was a free ride, a piggybacking on the US to power in Kabul. Now, if that doesn't happen immediately, after September, the ground realities will change. Will Taliban lose its salience if it does not engage? Will it still be treated with the same legitimacy and same sort of warmth around the globe if it continues the jihad when the foreign invader itself has disappeared? So it will need a new narrative to keep motivating its own cadres to continue fighting and killing Afghans. So there are a number of implications. Plus, I see signs that they are perhaps trying to bite more than they can chew. And two examples I can give you. One is the instantaneous rebuff given to Qatar and Turkey when this UN initiative was suggested. Now, they forget that they ultimately are in Doha at the invitation of Qataris. Can they displease their hosts? Turkey remains an important player. Turkey is part of the NATO forces, but its garrison has been really protecting Kabul. And only yesterday there were reports, and I also believe that that's one military force. If somebody will continue not wearing a NATO cap, but as a regional force, Turkey may be asked by many, and it will be acceptable to most, to continue if it wants to play a role. Second one is, of course, their latest statement of the day before, where they have actually warned not only Pakistan, without naming, but all the neighbors, that if they agreed to continuance of American base or any presence of counterterrorism force, will be a historical and disgraceful act, and that they will fulfill their historical and religious responsibility. Obviously, what is unstated is to perhaps clear the Americans from the region. So now, haven't they assumed a role which is much bigger and beyond their remit? See, they are not only talking about what the territory that they're looking at to controlling Afghanistan, but they're also now talking on behalf of the entire region, that they don't want American presence anywhere. So all this bromance of US and Taliban seems short-lived. So obviously in Taliban's mind, America remains an enemy, that it has no right to be anywhere in the region, even if it is outside of Afghanistan. So these are different sort of interpretations you can make out of it. And I have a feeling that they are going a step forward. Of course, there could be a cynical view that this Taliban statement itself was written by the Pakistanis to get the American pressure off. While there are very good reasons why Pakistan should allow US, but it also has some good reasons and geopolitical reasons why it will find it very difficult. And we have seen this in the past when the Saudis put pressure on the Pakistanis who send troops. I think even before the government reacted, their parliament passed a resolution. So they do have these mechanisms to deflect pressure and tell, listen, we can't sort of buy perpetual enmity with Taliban. We have to live with them. They are connected with the TTP and Al Qaeda. So maybe it's a way out. I don't know. We will have to look into all these things. But the fact is that peace will not come unless the regional countries stop looking at Afghanistan from a geopolitical lens. You see, what you see and what I fear is that it will become a game of buzkashi, where that poor Caracas would be the Afghan people, and all these guys will be pulling it in different directions. You see, because each one's objective, and if they want to continue running Afghanistan through proxies, I think we are looking at a very unstable future, at least in the short term. Whether the traditional Afghan wisdom of getting together, coming to a consensus, will be allowed to play out, I am not very sure. Because as Sushant said, that Taliban, no matter what it says, the fact is that it remains completely dependent just to be a potent military force on Pakistan. Without the Pakistani state support, I don't think Taliban would have been a potent force that could bring down the entire international security forces up to 100,000 to its knees, where they believe that there is no military outcome possible. So I will stop here, but I must compliment all of you for covering some other points which I have about specific countries. The role, but two quick points I would like to make. That what Secretary Blinken said, that the end of free ride is over. I also believe that there were some regional countries which are really free riding. First, because they were driven by an anti-Americanism. Second, look at the role of Russia. It has been alluded that it became active middle of last sort of decade. But it was really after the success in Syria, where they inserted themselves on the global platform once again, and that they thought of coming back in the Afghan sort of matrix, and very actively so. And I think they did a good job with the Moscow format. They sort of made it more participatory, more inclusive, opened it up from a purely bilateral track that the US was following in Doha. Second, China. While China has deep pockets with all the wherewithal to play a very, very important role, and also has the great promise of the huge checks it can write. But the fact is, till now, China has been a free rider. You see, their insertion, whether their closeness with Taliban is through Pakistan, because of the access to Pakistan, they have access to Taliban. They have been supporting, their weapons have been given to them. They have also supported Afghan government, but not to the extent that we can expect from second largest economy. And third, their biggest problem is that they have their entire policy is Pakistan centric for different reasons, not because of Afghanistan. So they start with a huge handicap that unless they can have an independent policy, it will always sort of play second fiddle to Pakistani interest in the region. Now, that is something for the Chinese to sort of attract. So I see interesting time. Unfortunately, it will be a tough time for the Afghans. No, I don't see sort of signs that peace will descend very quickly. And also on the Republican side, I feel that while there is a lot of resentment against President Ghani's style of functioning, there is no unity. In a sense, I can see three different parties: the Taliban, the other leaders, nationalist leaders, and the government and his advisors. They seem to be sort of unable to decide on a common way forward. So let us see how that pans out in Kabul. And only then we will know. But as of now, well, we may have end of war, but we may not have peace immediately. Thank you very much. But I think I took more time than you had told me.
That's okay. That's okay. And Kabir, thanks for stepping in. And my apologies. The power went out and my power backup failed, but now I'm back. So I suppose we can get started. Thank you, Ambassador Sinha. We'll come back to you in a bit. But I want Ibraheem to come in now. And I have, just to set the tone for what he's going to say, I just have a couple of things which I want to flag for him. One, we are hearing a lot of this talk about a power sharing agreement, and everybody seems to have jumped onto that bandwagon. But Ibrahim, do you actually think that any kind of a stable power sharing agreement, even if it's an interim agreement, is likely with the Taliban at this stage? Or is a power sharing agreement only, to use that old Arab proverb of a camel putting its nose in the tent and then, what happens after that, we know. Or is it going to pan out like that? Secondly, what is the mood on the streets in Afghanistan? Is there panic? Is there a kind of a fatalism that what will happen will happen? Is there a kind of a resolve, at least among the people who are not particularly enamored of the Taliban, to fight back? What exactly is the mood? And finally, on the Ambassador Sinha also spoke about it. In your paper, you have written about it. The political scene inside Afghanistan at a time when you have the Taliban, again, proverbially, at the gates of Kabul, to have the kind of political squabbling which is going on. I don't know how much sense it makes unless people are cutting their own side deals and hoping that they'll be able to survive. So I just wanted that, you could take up these issues in your presentation and whatever else you want to say. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for those broad but quite difficult questions. They are important to cover, so I'll give it my best go. I think with the US, since President Biden has announced that he's withdrawing from Afghanistan, it kind of had two impacts. On the one hand, it exacerbated or antagonized the Taliban because the deadline went beyond the agreed deadline of May the 1st. On the other hand, it settled in with all the sides involved that the US is finally withdrawing, and everyone needs to prepare for a reality where the US will not be as involved in Afghanistan. That has had an impact on the Republican side. We've seen since the original paper was published, as Ambassador Sinha before mentioned, the moment you publish one, developments happen that require another rewrite of another paper. So since that paper was published, the announcements been made by President Biden, and now we are seeing the Afghan Republic really scrambling. I don't know if scrambling is the right word, but they are quite active on two fronts. On the one hand, they're developing a military strategy on how they can continue to defend the territory they control and perhaps regain territory militarily once the US withdraws. On the other hand, at the highest political level, we are seeing an effort to develop a more united kind of political front. We've seen President Ghani, this was in the Abdullah and President Ghani's agreement of 2020, but we've seen in the past few weeks, the Afghan Republic has really gone full swing in trying to develop the High Council or the High State Council. So that's an opportunity I believe that the Afghan government's using to try to bring all the various disparate actors who support the Republic in principle, but might not necessarily support the individuals at the top decision making or the policies, trying to bring them together to have a uniform and unified front when progressing with the Taliban. That's a positive development in the other sense as well, because the Afghan government, it shows the Afghan government's continuing to think about how the peace process will progress as well post US withdrawal. So I think that's personally, I think it's a positive step that Republic is even they're preparing for military confrontation, but they haven't neglected the peace process, and they are trying to take steps in that regard. In terms of the mood on the streets, unfortunately, I'm not residing in Afghanistan at the moment, so I can't speak to at that personal level. But what we have observed is two almost contradictory moods based on observing from afar. On the one hand, we see some military forces in Afghanistan. If, for example, the New York piece that came out yesterday or the day before, which shows that the morale of some of the security forces, not all, but at least some that are more locally based, it's plummeting in Afghanistan. And the Taliban have been utilizing that as an opportunity to negotiate surrenders, wide-scale surrenders. Examples were cited in Laghman province. Previous to that, in Kandahar, there was a bit of, we saw the impact of that low morale as well when the Taliban advanced the end of 2020. But we've seen it again in Laghman province with the Taliban at the gate of the provincial capital. But on the other hand, we're also seeing a lot of ethnic communities, kind of a lot of previous commanders or warlords or people who had been previously involved in the Afghanistan's conflicts in one capacity or another. They're mobilizing local opposition forces to the Taliban. So that's particularly the case in the north and the west of the country. We're seeing quite consistent efforts by various commanders and actors to develop local forces that would be able to resist a Taliban advance. So I called it contradictory because on the one hand, you're seeing plummeting of morale in one sense, but on the other, you're seeing a galvanization and a kind of a determination to resist a Taliban military takeover. Coming to the first question that you mentioned of power sharing, it's a difficult question to answer for me always, because I personally believe both sides are willing to share power. However, the gap between what each side wants for themselves and what they're willing to offer to the other side continues to be unsurmountable. From what we've seen, the Afghan government, if we use the High State Council example, and this is not confirmed, but based on reports, rumors in the media that there were 8 seats that were going to be proposed, 8 members of the 8 people who were going to sit in this council, and 1 seat was going to be reserved for the Taliban. So, I mean, it's a basic, simple assumption, but based on that, that's like proposing to the Taliban a 20% or just over 20% power sharing. Whereas the Taliban, I think, would be quite hard pressed to accept anything under 49% or 50%. So that gap between the two sides continues to be quite, again, based on media rumors. I think the Taliban were proposing a 8-member council with 4 seats for them and 4 for the other Republican side. And the Republican side proposed 8 seats, 7 for various actors within the Republican framework and 1 for the Taliban. So I think there continues to be a gap, and also the vision in terms of what a power sharing agreement would look like and how it would govern going forward. I think there's also a big gap between how the Republican side and how external observers imagine this arrangement will look like, and how the Taliban would view the arrangement. I think what the Taliban don't want to do is enter into an arrangement where they will be in the same situation that President Ghani was following the National Unity Agreement, where he was unable to remove governors or ministers because there was a political agreement that kind of bind his power. So I think that in terms of the vision of what a power arrangement looks like, I think the Taliban probably would not want to go into that kind of arrangement. I'll hand the floor back to you unless you've got any follow-up question for me.
Yeah, I'll just one thing which I wanted to ask, about the power sharing arrangement. One is how, what the composition of the power sharing arrangement is going to be. But in your assessment, whatever the power sharing arrangement, 20%, 40%, 60%, whatever, how does it work given the massive gap between the Republican principle and the emirate? So how does the power sharing arrangement, assuming you can arrive at an arrangement like that, how does this thing move forward from there? Conflicts in that which are inbuilt into that system between the Republic and the emirate not bring down this entire power sharing arrangement?
Again, thank you for that question, a very important question. And I just want to answer that by caveating something. I think one of the reasons why there hasn't been a lot of progress in the talks is exactly because this is the meat of the issue. And I don't believe both sides have had a vision. They've developed a vision where they can reconcile these differences. In the same way, when it comes to, as you mentioned, the proportions, there's a disagreement and a bridge between the two sides. Similarly, in the concepts that they're proposing for a future government, there's a lot of difference between what the vision of the Afghan government looks like in terms of democracy, separation of powers, rights for women, etc., and rights for minorities, and what the Taliban vision for a future government looks like. I don't believe either side, or at least on the Taliban side, I suppose, because they have had to, from a military kind of stance, start thinking of developing a political vision. There hasn't been a lot of development in this area, which again is unfortunate, because at the end of the day, regardless of how much percentage of power there is, the issues would have to be overcome in terms of what a joint vision looks like. I can offer my personal opinion, but again, not sure how helpful it is, because unless the two sides themselves develop the vision they want and what kind of compromises they're willing to make, I suppose just speculating on or presenting a personal opinion might not be as beneficial.
Thanks, Ibrahim. Kriti, if I can just come to you now. Call it the spoiler, call it the trump card, call it what you will, but the role of Pakistan has always been, at least for the last 20 years, been critical. At this stage, the Pakistanis seem to be, telling everybody that they are not comfortable with the idea of a complete Taliban takeover. Do you buy that? Number one. Number two, if they are indeed sincere in what they are saying, and that's, you really have to take a leap of faith when it comes to Pakistan being sincere about what they are saying. But let us, for a moment, for the sake of argument, assume that they are sincere. What can they do to, stall the Taliban or moderate their position at this point in time. Third, there has been this controversy which has erupted over the last week or so on the Americans seeking bases inside Pakistan. Uh, do you think the Pakistanis will, they've done it in the past, will they do it again? That they will say that they're not going to give any bases, or they will try and figure out some way of handing over or making some arrangement with the Americans to give them bases? Do you think that's possible, given the kind of situation which exists inside Pakistan? And finally, on the Taliban issue itself, I know you've done some work with legislators lawmakers in Afghanistan on things like women's rights, on minorities' rights. Uh, do you really think that the Taliban uh, would be ready to accept the various ethnic minorities, the religious minorities, the women, or do you think we are going back to the 1990s?
So I'll start with Pakistan and then I'll sort of fold in the Taliban angle. I think Pakistan just sort of sees the peace process as an annoyance, as sort of just a formality that they need to get out of the way in order for their allies, the Taliban, to get some sort of power in Kabul. And they've been wary of the US pushing their withdrawal date for this very reason, because it delays the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan. So irrespective of what happens, I believe that Pakistan's quest for installing their proxy state will continue. And I think at the moment, they sort of have a short-term goals in terms of what they want within the next 1 year, and then long-term in terms of what they would want in the next 5 years to what should happen in Afghanistan. In the short term, the sooner the US leave, the better, because then the Taliban can either have a military takeover of Kabul, or depending on how things progress, some sort of sharing of power with certain groups in Kabul. And if the US leaving, in fact, doesn't really change things for the Pakistan relationship, because as you mentioned, Washington still needs Pakistan's airspace. They still need the boulevard to transport their aid and equipment. And Pakistan are continued to going to do their bare minimum that they have done since 2001 to meet the basic requirements for what the US asks of them. For bases, I'm a little hesitant on whether there would be a US base in that area. It would be the loss that it could, the dangers of the US stationing forces in Western Pakistan are huge, given that the TTP is back. Not that they ever went anywhere, but that they've regrouped and that they and that they're targeting foreign forces.
Kriti, I think your connection is a little...
But the Taliban being in a power position helps. They're going to benefit from their access to the Central Asian republics if the Taliban controls the northern areas. One issue which we don't talk about, and there haven't been too many discussions about, is what has happened to the Taliban's massive financial network of drug trafficking, and how much money they reap from it. And that's in Pakistan's interest if the Taliban have control over certain areas as well. So they're going to reap those profits from the drug trade as well. As of now, they're just ensuring that the Taliban stay on the negotiating table. The Taliban are also setting their own terms, like they did a few days ago with the peace process in Istanbul. They said we're not going to discuss any critical issues. The discussions should not be longer than 3 days. So the Pakistan is just going to do their bare minimum, sort of bring the Taliban to the table, say we've done our bit. There's not so much that we can influence them. You try your luck. As for the Taliban, they're the strongest that they have ever been. They have outlasted the US. They didn't need to beat the US. They just had to outlast them, which they have done. They control large swaths of territory in the country. And their military strategy has sort of, if you imagine it like a hangman's noose, in terms of wide at the start, and then it comes in at the center. They've been capturing rural areas and slowly making their way to major population centers or provincial capitals. And they sort of complemented this military strategy letters and peace offerings to different regional power brokers to see whether they can reach regional agreements and sort of break those divisions which already exist within the government. Its formal statements have remained conciliatory. Last year, they had asked WHO, they had said that we will help the WHO with whatever they need to do to combat COVID in Afghanistan. They're telling the Australians not to worry as Australia ponders removing their embassy from Kabul. So Taliban is as strong as ever, and the Taliban and Pakistan is happy about that, and they're just going to do their bare minimum and claim that we've done all that we could, and now it's up to them.
Yeah, well, that's what it looks like. But this whole business of trying to appear reasonable to the rest of the world. Do you think the rest of the world is actually buying into it? Because the actual experience is that in the places or the territories that they have captured, their behavior is no different than what it was in the 1990s. So I don't know, this whether it's on their links with some of the terror groups, whether it's their policies on minorities, on opposition groups. Nothing seems to have changed. So do you think the rest of the world is likely to buy into it?
No, I don't think the rest of the world buys into it at all. But what is different, while the Taliban's ideology from the 90s has not changed, they continue to bomb maternity wards, schools. But what has changed is their sort of the legitimacy which the US has granted to them, one, but also that now they have stronger ties with Russia and China. So it's not only the US Taliban relationship which has granted them legitimacy. They still have their Russia and China have also developed their direct contacts with the Taliban. So even though the international community is in no way buying that the Taliban have changed, even if the US sort of that doesn't shun them again as a pariah state, but even if the US and the Taliban are on opposing sides within the next few months, they still have support from Russia and China, whatever little that support means, which is something that they did not have in the 90s. And that's what's the key difference from the group back then and now.
Thanks. Kabir, let's talk about the other big country in Afghanistan's neighborhood, which is Iran. Very pivotal player. See, we know that the Iranians have had links with the Taliban, which is quite different from what it was in the 90s. But that was probably because the Americans were present, and the principal contradiction for the Iranians at one point of time was the American presence rather than the Taliban. But now with the Americans withdrawing, do you think that the Iranian position is likely to change? But that is just one thing I want you to address. The second thing is the Ambassador Sinha has also spoken about it, but perhaps you can also weigh in on it, on the number of other players who are involved or with interest in Afghanistan. So are these players in Afghanistan for Afghanistan's sake, or are they for their own sake? Because the two do not necessarily match. And if their interests, number one, vis-a-vis other players are contradictory, and their interests vis-a-vis the Afghan interests are contradictory, then this whole business of trying to involve multiple players, regional players, everybody and everybody's aunt and uncle into resolving Afghanistan, how does that play out? In the sense, how does that even lead to any kind of a solution? So both on the Iran angle as well as the too many cooks trying to cook the broth.
Right. Look, the Iran angle is actually very underplayed and equally important, right? That's one country that does not figure very vocally, at least, on the outcomes or the debates around the Afghan conundrum. But they are a geographic neighbor with a very big boundary. And over the past couple of years, of course, the Iranians, considering the situation with the US, especially during the Trump administration, they did find a level of commonality with the Taliban on some issues, which includes not having a US military presence in Afghanistan or anywhere around Afghanistan. So that there is a commonality of thought there. But if you also see, for example, Foreign Minister Zarif's statements on Afghanistan over the past couple of years or couple of months, they have been fairly balanced. They have not played up too much about the US withdrawal or what the Taliban is attempting to do within Afghanistan and so on and so forth. They have called for the usual asks, which is peace and stability and so on and so forth. They want a stable Afghanistan on their turf and so on. But let's also be honest that what necessarily Minister Zarif says or President Rouhani says is not what plays out when Iran is thinking about foreign policy. A lot of it is handled by the IRGC directly. And we've seen that in Afghanistan as well. While these statements of stability and peace within Afghanistan have come, the Iranians have also looked to create the Fatemian Brigade in Afghanistan, taken fighters from Afghanistan and placed them in Syria, in the Syrian theater. So there are two sides to how Iran works out when it comes to Afghanistan. But there is a sense that first and foremost they now know that the American presence is in a withdrawal, and I think Iranians are going to be realistic about it. They are not going to expect a complete absence of American powers from the region. Now, what that constitutes, or how the American power is going to look, I think is very debatable at the moment. That is one of the fractured points, I think, that is allowing a lot of free and fluid debate on what Afghanistan is going to look beyond September. Is that the Americans haven't clarified or haven't clarified within themselves as well of what their presence is going to be, if any. So if you see the Taliban statement that they released yesterday, I think, which let me see if I can pull it up, which literally reads out, the Muslim and Mujahid nation of Afghanistan will not remain silent before such heinous and provocation acts, which means potential of US bases in and around Afghanistan, including in Pakistan and in Central Asia. Rather, it will fulfill its religious and historical responsibilities in the same way as it has performed throughout history. Now, they haven't said whether this means against Pakistan or Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. They are taking it as a whole. So even if, let's say, I mean, it's probably not going to happen. Let's say if there is a clandestine base in Pakistan, I think Afghanistan is saying that may well be fair game as well. So I think there's understanding Taliban right now is very shooting in the dark kind of thing, because there is a lot of churn happening within. So even when you see if you see some of the debates around the Taliban around the Turkey conference, which Iran was also supporting, and Iran wanted it to happen at the earliest. The team from Doha went and met the Taliban leadership in Pakistan, stayed there for nearly a month, and have come out with this vague sense of not more than 3 days. We will not discuss anything that is pivotal in decision making on what happens in the future and so on and so forth. So I think it's from every perspective, including the Iranians right now, who are going to look at Afghanistan from a very American lens at the moment, because they do know they can manage if the Taliban plays a larger part in the future, or the government of whatever the political balance is going to be in Kabul. They know that they can manage with whatever comes that way, right? Whether it's the Taliban or any other factions and so on and so forth. Which is why India is very interested, at a certain level at least, to make sure that they are engaging with the Iranians as well when it comes to Afghanistan. So there is no, I mean, just understanding how the Taliban is working right now in its thought process is a challenging task in itself. I don't think it's black and white. I think within Taliban also there are a lot of debates and discussions on what the future looks like. And you've already seen the couple of people, especially local leaders in Afghanistan, pushing back on the Taliban a little bit, or preparing to push back a little bit. You see, I mean, just the power plays that are happening with the recent return of a politician from Herat because they didn't want that person as I think it was governor position or so on and so forth, and his helicopter was turned around midway. So we are going to see these play out a little more and more. So I think maximalist or absolutist takes right now on how the Taliban is going to be, or how the regional countries are going to deal with, is going to be very difficult till a proper US withdrawal happens, which is close to fruition, and there is clarity on what the US presence is going to be in and around Afghanistan, whether that be diplomatic or militaristic. If there is if it's a complete withdrawal, which I don't think is going to happen, without any CT forces around and stuff like that, the landscape is going to look extremely different from what we are perceiving it at the moment.
So, Kabir, if the landscape is going to look completely different, let's talk about the Fatimiyun Brigade. In the 90s, when the Iranians got involved in Afghanistan, it was through Afghans who were resisting the Taliban, the Northern Alliance and whatever. There was the Hizb-e-Wahadat, but and the Iranians had some skin in the game. But if you look at what the Fatimiyun Brigade is supposed to be, it still remains a very shadowy organization. Do you think that this is the Iranian leverage, which is likely to come into play if, as you say, things go really bad going forward, to protect Iranian interests? Number one. Number two, what about the Iranian contacts with groups like the Al-Qaeda and others? We know that, and you mentioned that in your article as well, that, they've maintained those contacts. They've even helped some of those guys. Of course, it's all deniable, but nevertheless, those are what the reports are. How does that dynamic play out going forward in Afghanistan?
Look, I think the Al-Qaeda part specifically, and I'll deal with that first, is again, it's very difficult to ascertain what a long-term game from Iranian perspective is, right? So even if you see how the Al-Qaeda leadership reportedly has been living in Tehran, it's in a very sort of a constricted manner. There's not a lot of freedom that they have, so they have been kept alive, and that seems to be the baseline. That if you live in Tehran, if we give you some sort of shelter in Tehran, at least the Americans are not going to get you. Well, which was debatable in itself with the Israeli actions at times. But I genuinely, it's beyond the point, cannot fathom what the Iranians want to do with Al-Qaeda in their soil. Like, it's guesswork at best. You can, of course, the general consensus would be it's a ploy to make sure that they have significant leverage, not just against the Afghans not just Americans in Afghans, but also the Taliban. Right, because for example, a lot of discussions have been had that the Taliban must break off its relations with Al-Qaeda, and it is there in the February 2020 documentation between the US and the Taliban as well. But what's the methodology of how do you put that in practice? How do you know that? Right. So even if you see the document from 2020 between the US and the Taliban, it's just two statements. There is no pressure leverage. There is no ideations on how the Taliban is supposed to, without any sort of cloak and dagger kind of situation, how are they supposed to deliver on those promises? Right, and the Americans knew that this beyond a point that is not going to happen. Even today, when the Taliban, with a lot of confidence, specifically after years and years of saying that we only care about Afghanistan, we don't really care about what happens beyond its geographical boundaries, are saying today that if the American bases come in Uzbekistan or Tajikistan or in Afghanistan, it's fair game. Taliban does not have the capacity amongst themselves to actually play out that fair game. They will need other actors such as Al-Qaeda to act, who have experience of transnational terrorism, moving money beyond borders. And I'm not talking about opium money, right? That's a very sort of ground-based way of how the Taliban raises funds. But they will need these kind of actors to play these eventualities out. Earlier, the Taliban was not using this kind of language which they use yesterday, for example. So when it, and you can be Al Qaeda and come in and out of Taliban. Who will know? How will you know? And how does that? No one's wearing a high visibility jacket that says Al Qaeda at the back. So and the Iranians know that, for example. So they are playing the cards, I think, fairly smartly at the moment. They still see America leaving the region as their primary target. That primary target also is of the Taliban. And what happens after that, I think the Iranians are very confident that they can manage within their political and geopolitical ecosystems. They don't need third parties to help them out there. So I think that's again, it's a lot of conjecture at the moment. As I said, unless the Americans present an actual plan that goes beyond 5 pages that they released last year, it's very difficult to sort of call things out.
Kalpit, let me just come to you now, and if you can, so according to Kabir, the Iranians seem to be pretty confident on handling the fallout. The Pakistanis seem to be pretty confident on handling the fallout, although they are pretending, because that's where the money lies, that they're not that confident. They need the support of others as well. But what is the reading of what's happening or what's playing out in Afghanistan in China? Secondly, and related to that, do you see the possibility of the Chinese stepping in to fill up the vacuum left by a possible or complete withdrawal of the Americans to stabilize the region? Because a lot of the Chinese BRI plans seem to hinge around what happens in Afghanistan. Not necessarily because BRI goes through Afghanistan, but instability in Afghanistan then impacts on some of these BRI projects. So are they ready to, put their, actually invest, put boots on the ground, or do something to make sure that they are likely to become the big daddies insofar as Afghanistan is concerned? Or is their entire policy premised on what the Pakistanis are going to do? In other words, ride on Pakistan's shoulders to settle what happens in Afghanistan. And finally, something which I found, I wouldn't say controversial, but something which I found somewhat contradictory in my view, in your on your paper, where you talk about the Chinese collaboration with the Afghan army, building up of the Afghan state's military capabilities. How does that fit in with all this talk about the Chinese opening up and being, in a manner of speaking, ready to accept the Taliban, who are then proxies of their client state, Pakistan? Uh, I see a contradiction in that, but perhaps you can resolve it for us.
Okay, so I'd like to start with this thought that the People's Daily, in fact, refers to Afghanistan in fact, in many of its commentaries, as a graveyard of empires, and that China will have to tread with caution. It talks about immense challenges and immense opportunities. Now, if this withdrawal had to happen a few years ago, China was predominantly thinking about the whole doctrine of Thao Quang Yang, where Deng Xiaoping spoke about that we will first develop our economy, we will develop our national capabilities, and only then should we lunge for world leadership or global leadership. Now, very interestingly, since Xi Jinping's, in fact, his second term, there is a constant use of this word called Fanfa Yowei. Now, Fanfa Yowei speaks about how China needs to, assert itself or exert itself in Asia. That it needn't be confined to a certain its own geographic borders, but it has to assert itself. Now, this power projection can, what form it is going to take, we can only speculate. But yes, um, the whole, China calls it the counterterrorism base in Tajikistan, very close to the Wakhan corridor. Now that has been happening. Um, Combat units. There has been talk of the PLA, helping the Afghanistan army with a mountain combat unit. So somewhere, I think this power projection. Also, there is this whole yearning among in China that it is now the superpower, and that it needs to one of the writers talks about how the US power projection also happens through a lot through conflict resolution. So I think like a kind of a Camp David kind of a scenario, which Chinese media says that this is a typical, or this is an ideal thing for a Camp David kind of a thing, which again falls in the ambit of Fanfa Yove. That is, China trying to exert itself or assert itself in Asia. So yes, these are these kind of things are there. However, China has China will not. Of course, these are all debatable, and these might change with times. But I think for China, it is more important to kind of have its focus towards Taiwan and South China Sea, rather than commit its troops or in Afghanistan.
Okay, we have about half an hour left, and there are some interesting questions which have come in. Let me put the first ones to Ambassador Sinha, because some of these are to do with India, and I'm paraphrasing the issues which have been raised for Ambassador Sinha. So first and foremost, of course, is what is India's policy going forward? Until now, our policy has been that we are supporting whichever is the government in Kabul, the legitimate government in Kabul. But going forward, some of the questions are that should we review our policy options? Should we open up lines of communication with the Taliban? That is one. The second one, and I'm putting all the two or three which I've come across to you. The second one is that we focus too much on soft power in Afghanistan. All surveys put India as a fairly popular country, or probably the most popular country in Afghanistan. So the soft power thing seems to have worked. But what is soft power without hard power? And that is somewhere where we seem to have faltered. How do you look at it? And finally, which is related to the second part which I've asked you, because this is a question which people are asking, that if there is some kind of talk, or from the American side, or some of the Pakistanis are talking about it constantly, that the Americans want to put India in Afghanistan. Do you even think it possible that India would be ready to put boots on ground in Afghanistan? Ambassador Sinha. Sir, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Good question. Let me focus. In fact, very interesting discussion. I've been making some notes also, because I had also some questions from the panelists, which I'll raise later. I'll send to you.
No, you can. You finish your answers and please raise your questions.
Yes. You see, a lot of this debate has gone on that whether India should review its policy, whether we should open direct lines of communication with Taliban, etc., etc. We will have to understand the nature of Taliban itself. See, either it is a proxy force or it is an independent agency. If it is a proxy force, then I think you don't have access. And even if you had access, you may or may not have influence. And to say that India doesn't have lines of communication with Taliban, I think that we would be sort of underestimating India's capacities. In terms of messaging, what we need to tell them, what they need to convey to us, I think that all happens, because India has changed its policy. If you see, that we have said once the Afghan public opinion said that Taliban should be part of the power structure, India has also gone along with that. And that is, I think, very consistent policy that the entire process that evolves should be Afghan owned, Afghan led. And at times, I think it is good to, especially in your own neighborhood, to stay a step behind the public opinion. This distinction between soft power and hard power, it depends on how you define hard power. Does hard power necessarily mean Indian boots on the ground? I would think no, because that will be absolute suicide, and Afghanistan doesn't need that sort of a presence. But if you think hard power in terms of supporting the military or hard capacities of Afghanistan to be able to repulse Taliban or to defend itself, I think India has not been lacking in that, whether it is training, equipment, resources, all that has gone. It may have not been sort of tom-tommed too much, but all that has happened. But I'm sure everybody knows about the helicopters and things that you needed. And you also have to remember that last 20 years, entire NATO operations, the way it is structured is the entire Afghan defense forces are on what is called NATO's Tashkil or something. It's a word, where it's on their inventory. The airspace is controlled by them. So it's not that you can just go and do anything that you want. Even if you gave equipment, unless it gets onto the NATO's inventory, it will not be financed. No, the petrol will not come. Suppose, for example, if we gave 100 tanks to Afghanistan, they will not be able to use it because every entire military is being funded by Americans. So we have to understand the mechanics of it. So I don't think we have been. And the soft power, it's not song and dance or soap operas or dramas that India has relied on. That soft power has taken the form of serious capacity building of the nation. Ultimately, when you are building a nation from scratch, what it lacks most is human capacity of governance, of auditing, of financials, recruitments, placement. So in all these areas, India has sort of worked very, very closely with them because I think, and that is also the way we felt that a nation could be built only if it had strong institutions, and institutions needed capable and well-trained people. And that is why today you have a cadre of over 60,000 Indian educated graduates and students. You look at the military, one of the top officials who are there are all from NDA and IMA. And half of the deputy ministers, minister levels are good graduates. So you see, that is also part of what one can call soft power. But that, yes, that also gets you influence. But to getting into Afghanistan and this thing that US wants us to put into Kabul, I don't buy it at all because I really feel that it is part of South Asia, it is part of SARC. India is a natural leader, and I don't think it is for other powers outside of the region to grant you that sort of courtesy to be present or non-present. You see, I don't think anybody talks like that except Pakistan, which says India has no role and should not be present. But that also is a decision of the Afghan government and people. Suppose tomorrow, whatever be the formation of government, doesn't want to have a relationship with you, I don't think India can force itself on having a diplomatic relations. It's a mutual two-way street. And I think we have to be very practical about these things. Hopefully that will not come. As far as Taliban is concerned, you see, we have always argued that, to granting it legitimacy before it shows any sign of reconciliation was a bad policy. And that is the only reason why India perhaps publicly did not embrace them, because it would have got you nothing. If Taliban was a free agent and had the ability to talk to you and actually give you assurances, it was a different matter. But on issues of key concern to us, you just look at their own statements after, say, when the Article 370 was changed in Kashmir. and Shah Qureshi said that this will have an impact on Afghan peace process. Taliban issued a statement immediately that India we don't see as an enemy country, and we don't think Taliban Mujahideens are willing to go and fight a battle in Kashmir. Uh, and they have welcomed India's development partnership and role in construction and reconstruction of the government. So there are signs that you have. And of course, trust me, there are a lot of former Taliban, their family members in Afghanistan, and it's not that we are completely in a vacuum or in dark as far as what they're thinking, whether we outreach to them. No, they have been, I'm sure there are informal contacts. So I think we should feel fairly assured about ourselves there. See, as long as, and even when Taliban comes, ultimately you look at this, it may be seen as a short term setback to you. The Taliban has taken over, but if they are part of a power sharing, just look back and see where you stood when the Mujahideens came and took power in Kabul, and what was different then. Ultimately, they all became your friends. You see, so I believe that most nationalist Afghan political forces will be natural partners with India, not because of India's great attraction or soft power alone, but this is a mutual dependency. And you see, historically, we forget that our borders with both Iran and Afghanistan only finished in 1948. No, we have had common borders for history. So the historical memories of people where they don't recognize Pakistan. They always thought that the area beyond Khyber or after Indus was Hindustan. So these are things which are too deeply ingrained to be just wished away by geopolitics or a temporary presence of Americans, etc. On China, I just wanted to add, you see, while what I had mentioned initially, you see, Chinese policies in Afghanistan, and this is my perception, I could be very wrong, has been not about Afghanistan, it has been about China. Just look at the investments, look at even the offer of military assistance. How did this mountain division idea come about? You see, first, their main concern was that the Afghan NDS and Afghan security forces should cooperate with Chinese to get the ATIM guys back and hand them over, which the government did. And this happened after the Zarbayas when they were displaced from Fatah and moved into Afghanistan. And many of them were caught and sent back. Then their copper mine in Logar was not going forward. Then the idea of actually creating a special forces to protect that mining area was created, which obviously was not acceptable to Afghan government. No self-respecting government would want foreign troops protecting industrial units. That is how it evolved into a mountain division in Badakhshan, which basically to insulate Xinjiang from Badakhshan area, because Badakhshan had become a hotbed for Taliban, and a lot of these, after Zarbayas, a lot of these movements that had taken place had moved to northern Afghanistan. So this happened in 2014-15. But if you look at the other track record of development, because China has deep pockets, it's investing $60 billion, or at least promising to invest next door. Has it even reached $1 billion in Afghanistan? Or even 100 million? Please tell me. There are lots of necessities, schools, colleges, roads, dams, which China can do, which are civilian projects. Why has it not done? So there must be a reason. And that reason precisely is that it doesn't want to do anything. Because as Sushant said, that perhaps till now it was very happy just outsourcing this problem to Pakistan. And they have immense faith in Pakistani ability to manage different terror groups. Now the situation will change. Pakistan's dilemma is not with the Taliban leadership. Of course, there are their friends. They will be welcomed back in Kabul. But Pakistan will still face a challenge of the ideology of Taliban. No, if an emirate comes back and a radical, and if you see the statements, the way it has been made, already at the TTP, the Taliban Pakistan and Al-Qaeda already owe allegiance to Amir of Taliban. So you see, there is a certain network of terrorists also in the region. Why do you think Taliban today is speaking as if it can control Pakistani space? But there I have a nuance, and Sushant, you know Pakistan better. If you read at the statement of the Pakistani Foreign Ministry, where they have rejected immediately that there's no question of giving bases, but they have made a clarification that we already have ALOC and GLOC agreements in place. So now the question is that no, they're absolutely right. No new bases are being given. But the issue is, are they also abrogating those earlier agreements because American presence is reduced, so their presence is not required here? Or does one read more into it than what it is? That, I already have an agreement. If Americans tomorrow need to use it as transit, I guess they will have an access to that facility under an existing agreement. So that is something that we'll have to keep under watch. And I think I'll stop here, but very interesting points made by all of you. And I agree. In fact, now there's a huge move in Kabul to create this, what they call, High Leadership Council. But the debate really is its composition, as will always happen, and whether it will have real delegated authority in terms of creating. Because you see, the biggest challenge to the government has been this demand for an interim arrangement. Now, interim arrangement means what? That you sort of dissolve yourself as a government and then create a body which looks over the transition. Now, how that pans out, we don't know yet. Uh, Pakistan, of course, has been a champion of this interim arrangement. In fact, they started this thing even before the last elections, if you remember. There was a huge backlash in Afghanistan when Pakistan said, "Oh, you should follow our model, create an interim government before the elections, and then that should oversee the elections and formation of the next government." But let us see. Nobody wants a void in Afghanistan, and none of the neighbors, at least, except perhaps Pakistan. So I don't know how that will work out. Uh, Iranian Fatimiyyan Brigade, that's a new factor which was not there. And this one, unfortunately, is well trained, sort of, I think, well provisioned also. And if you see the sectarian nature of the violence, the way the violence of the Taliban or whoever is doing it is changing, uh, targeting Hazaras, this Hazara girls' school, I think that we will see perhaps more ethnic groups arming themselves. And it's a bit worrying that, the national army which represented Afghanistan, that seems to be, morale seems to be down. But there are different reasons. One reason itself is the confusing political message for the last 2 years. Whether you are negotiating, whether they are coming back, they are brothers, not brothers, so it confuses the military. When the enemy, definition of the enemy itself gets diffused. Second, this has been a policy since 2015 that the military posture has been that they will control the cities and leave the rural areas and withdraw these outposts and put them in garrisons with rapid reaction capability. That also has a downside. The rural areas get overrun very easily. So that is why when Taliban starts claiming that I control 40% of territory or 60% of territory, it means little, but it has a psychological impact. And of course, some of these border posts which are getting overrun. So I don't know whether they are military, but most of them are either Afghan local police or local militias. I could be wrong, but I don't think these are real military forces, the fighting capability. That, as a policy, in 2014, 2015, they have been withdrawing. So I will stop here. Of course, one can keep going on talking about different issues. But I think there's some of the key issues that I touched.
So, thank you, Ambassador Sinha. I just before I go to Ibrahim on a question which has been put, just two very quick observations on something you said, Ambassador Sinha. One is on the basis, the whole issue of the basis. Uh, it was only after the Salala attack that people actually got to know that the Pakistanis had actually given a base to the Americans. From where they could fly their combat missions, their drones, etc. In fact, not one, but they'd actually given them two bases. And that it is after that that they started withdrawing those base facilities. So all of it was done under the radar screen at a time when the Pakistanis were aiding and abetting the Taliban on the one side. They were giving bases and facilities to the Americans on the other side. So that's the game they play. Secondly, on your whole issue of uh, how things change in Afghanistan and how India becomes a natural friend, I don't know if it has something to do with what we do, but I suspect it has a lot to do with what the Pakistanis do. And how they try and interfere in Afghan affairs, and that makes us natural friends of the Afghans. But a question to Ibrahim which has come is on if there is, some kind of a Taliban domination in Afghanistan, what is the Taliban governance model? How does, whatever the Taliban stand for fit in with how a modern nation state, assuming the Taliban want a degree of modernity, want progress, want development? What is the governance model which the Taliban have going forward, which will inspire any degree of confidence even in the people? Ibrahim?
Thank you. I just want to, before I go to the question asked, I just want to share my thoughts with Ambassador Sinha. I think he provided a very nuanced and the relationship between Pakistan and the Taliban. He presented a very balanced and nuanced picture, which is very important. It's a highly polarized topic when it comes to Pakistan and the Taliban, but it's important to appreciate it with all the nuances that it carries. I personally see a lot in the media the question of how much influence Pakistan has with the Taliban. I think in some ways that's probably not the right question we should be asking. The reason for that, why I say this is, in the 1980s, Pakistan had a lot of influence with the Mujahideen factions, similar or perhaps even more than what they have with the Taliban. But it overreached or overused that power, and it built up sentiments or resentment within those Mujahideen factions that the moment they found space to be independent in Afghanistan, most of them were closer to India and to Iran and to other nations than they actually were with Pakistan. And that's the dilemma Pakistan faces today. It has few friends inside Afghanistan because of that historical overreach. With the Taliban, it also has a history of as you mentioned, that they were aiding and abetting the Taliban, but also providing support to the US, instrumental support that was, from the Taliban perspective, that's Pakistan's helping them, but also helping the enemies destroy them. So the Taliban's deputy leader one of the deputy leaders was killed in Pakistani prison. The next deputy leader spent several years inside Pakistani prisons before being released at the request of US Special Envoy. The third one was also who then went on to become the overall leader, was killed by a drone strike inside Pakistan. So I think Pakistan's acutely more aware than most observers that the goodwill it has also comes with a lot of resentment within the Taliban movement. The control it has, or whatever influence it has, there's also a lot of underlying resentment with the Taliban. And for that reason, I think Pakistan is very, very interested not to, at this crucial juncture, not to antagonize the Taliban. I think it doesn't see a lot of alternatives if it was to antagonize the Taliban. So I think the question we should be asking, given this context, is not how much influence Pakistan has, but how can or how should it use that influence when it comes to, given that they have all these calculations to make, if they want, and if they use the influence too much, it could antagonize the Taliban. As the ambassador pointed out, Al-Qaeda and TTP, both openly anti-Taliban movements, owe allegiance to the Taliban. The Taliban have actually never rejected those allegiances. So given this factor, how should Pakistan be navigating? I think that's in my opinion, at least my humble opinion, that's a more important question we should be exploring. In terms of the question you asked, a future where the Taliban becomes a dominant force, what would their governance look like, and what impact would development aid and things like that have? I think the Taliban have given us a glimpse of what it could look like. Since the Doha Agreement, there had been a lot of, we had seen very small, subtle signs on the Taliban side that they were willing to moderate their behavior in return for gaining international legitimacy and continued aid to the movement. They had been aligning their rhetoric in line with international norms. For example, when schools would get attacked or when health workers would get attacked, they would condemn it and say this is a behavior that's illegitimate and we shouldn't be done. Even in things, for example, recently civilians would get killed, they would say that they should be recompensated. They should be compensated for those, or people who were getting beaten up by Taliban commanders. They issued a ban saying, other than the judicial authorities, no one has the power to beat civilians. So there was the development and the recognition did have a moderating impact, but again. Another one of those my pet peeves, I suppose, is the question when it's asked, how much has the Taliban changed? I think the Taliban had little incentive to change during the past 20 years. They were in a state of war. War makes you more radicalized and more militarized. It doesn't moderate a movement or organization's behavior. And they were positioning against themselves against a changing force, against a changing Afghanistan, where they were saying these changes are driven by foreign occupiers or the US and its allies. So we need to be the reactionary power. We need to be the one that need to retain the soul and values of Afghanistan. So that also, that processing and messaging also has an impact in terms of how much they would have changed in the past 20 years. But in the future is where we should be looking out exactly how much the Taliban would be willing to evolve and change to accommodate the new Afghanistan that they would invariably come in contact with. I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ibrahim. Kriti, one of the things which everybody keeps talking about the last 20 years is the amount of progress that has been made. And apart from the fact that, there is a kind of a democratic model, a Republican model of governance which has come in. But I think a lot of people talk about, how the education for girls, progressive values coming in, minorities being treated much better, all those nice things which have happened over the last 20 years is what everybody says is worth protecting. But the way one looks at it, the moment, you have things going wrong in Afghanistan, these very things which everybody talks about protecting are likely to become the first casualty. Because that is, these are the things which actually nobody has a use for when the bullets start flying. How do you protect these, the progress made in these fields, whether it's on women, whether it's on smaller ethnicities, religious groups, a whole lot of other things? How do you protect, this going forward? I don't have any answers, but I was wondering, perhaps you might have some.
Well, I also would be very eager to know how you would protect the gains made over the last 20 years, because they are massive gains. And it would be very difficult, not only for Afghans and Afghan women and children and the entire civil society, but for the entire region once it starts backsliding. And I think I really don't know what's the best way to protect these gains, but I think this is where countries in the region, such as India, come in. And they play a huge role in ensuring, in doing whatever they can to protect the security. For example, the school which was recently bombed a few weeks ago, it's a region which has been bombed quite frequently, unfortunately. And yet security in that neighborhood remains still a little lax. So if regional countries could come forward in terms of not only training the ANDCF, but having more specialized training groups and special groups to focus on smaller areas or local policing, that would be just a very simple way of just protecting that area. How do you get the Taliban to change their thinking is anyone's best guess. I'm very skeptical about that happening. But because these gains are so important, I am extremely fearful that they will be backsliding. Another issue is when you bring in the regional countries, besides India, I think the other countries are more focused on providing support for the Taliban in whatever capacity that may be to prevent ISKP. And ISKP is just a mix of old Afghan Taliban, old TTP, old regional thing, and Kabir could talk about that a bit more. And Taliban just doesn't want anybody to jeopardize their monopoly on jihad that they have in Afghanistan. So it's important for regional countries to have specific things, specific areas that they could focus on, like it was in 2001 when NATO alliances came in and they all took responsibility for certain areas in Afghanistan. If people could do that, and I think that would be probably the only way in which we could protect the gains made and ensure that regional countries are not distracted by only focusing on we can appease the Taliban so that ISKP doesn't threaten our borders. I think that's important. And speaking to what Ibrahim and Ambassador Sinha said, Pakistan's influence, of course, Pakistan has influence, but how that's diminishing and whether that's diminishing, we don't know. How we have that proverb, you can take the horse to the water, but you can't make it drink. I think it's similar. You can bring the terrorist to the negotiating table, but you can't force him to put down his weapons. So it brings into the larger thing of how India also needs to work with countries around it, especially the EU, which is completely left out when we just focus on the region, to sort of widen their scope on what they see as terrorist groups and widen that ambit to the Haqqani network, widen that ambit to the TTP, so that that's beneficial for Afghans and for India and the region as well.
Okay, and there's one more question which I think maybe I'll just direct to you, and that is on the role of non-profits in bringing stability in Afghanistan. Do you really see them playing a major role in bringing stability, or I don't know, my skepticism aside?
So bringing stability is, of course, everyone's goal and everyone's aim, and non-profits may have a small role to play in. They do affect change, but there's a huge threat. We saw the attack which happened in the Doctors Without Borders hospital, which was absolutely horrific. And even if you have as many non-profits as you can, the ground reality remains the same, that the security of those non-profits who have the capacity to do great work in particular settings with the right funding and aid is majorly threatened. So can non-profits bring stability? I seriously doubt it. Can other great powers along with regional countries provide a level of stability in which non-profits can function with a lesser fear of being attacked? I am extremely hopeful. But I don't think that non-profits have a direct link and they can solve the entire problem, unfortunately.
Kabir, one question for you, which I think is right up your sleeve, which is on how are the elements of the Haqqani network going to be reined in? Because, Kabir, are you there? I don't know. Okay, let me see if Kabir comes back. Otherwise, I'll put that question to Ibrahim later on. But Kalpit, there's one question for you. Given the kind of treatment which the Chinese have been meting out to the Uyghurs, now within China, of course, there's complete denial that they're doing anything like this. And given that denial, I don't think that the Chinese media is going to even speculate that what can be the blowback vis-a-vis China's anti-Muslim policies in Afghanistan, going forward. But do you see some kind of a contradiction coming in where at one level the Chinese are trying to deal with the Taliban, at another level their own policies towards Muslims inside China, at a third level their general approach and attitude towards what is quote unquote called Islamic terrorism or Islamic terrorist groups? How are they going to? How do you see them resolve this particular contradiction?
So there's this very interesting commentary which I came across some time back. It talks about, this whole U.S. business in Afghanistan is seen as, China sees it as America's longest war. And, till this was going on, till this longest war was going on, China was able to kind of, build its strength. But today, and this war was also bleeding the US. So somewhere today, the state media is trying to say that look, this has also taken away a very important thing. because every time the West used to talk about the atrocities in Xinjiang or the mistreatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, you had a China which used to very vociferously talk about, very vociferously talk about the whole American narrative as far as Afghanistan was concerned. Now, with the withdrawal, in fact, some of the writers make a point that this will not be a complete withdrawal, because there will be some amount of US presence which will then be free to kind of have a leverage over the country, as well as quote unquote create headaches for China in its eastern border. So yes, so this is really the situation as far as China is concerned.
Thanks. Okay, and I think we've run out of time, but there is one last question which I need to put, and let me put this to Ibrahim. Ibrahim, we've spoken about the Fatimiyun Brigade being Iran's possible leverage to be used in Afghanistan if things come down to that pass. But there is also talk about the Haqqani network and the role they are going to play. Now, they're clearly part and parcel of the Taliban, conglomerate, or an integral part of the Taliban. They are literally in the leadership role in the Taliban at one level. So that is one part of it. But at another level, we know how beholden the Haqqani network has been to the Pakistanis. Their entire, the business operations which they run, that consortium which they run, whether it's of drugs, whether it's of all sorts of other smuggling networks, gun running, you name it. Apparently, they have an airline. I don't know what all they're supposed to have. But all of them, that is contingent on their ability to be on the right side of the Pakistanis. Do you see the Haqqani network as, in a manner of speaking, Pakistan's cat's paw within the Taliban movement? That if the Taliban were to start defying Pakistan going forward, as you said in your last intervention, the Pakistanis push them too hard, the Taliban start defying. Do you think the Haqqani network will come into play on the Pakistani side, or do you think that's likely to be an a typical miscalculation from the Pakistani side? Ibrahim.
Thank you. I'm hesitant to answer that question because, again, it'll be mostly based on speculation, exactly how much influence Pakistan has over the movement overall and how much influence it has with the leadership. I don't have the data or the facts to support the claims, and I'm not an expert on covert operations, on how a state would be getting that kind of access with different groups. I assume Pakistan might have people in the top leadership where they do have a lot of influence on individual leaders within the movement. But the Taliban's model of governance has been that decisions are currently not being made by one person. Rather, all strategic decisions are made by the leadership council, and then the top leader, whoever that may be, generally seems to have a veto power to veto a decision. That's the sense that I'm getting when it comes to the Taliban's leadership. In that context, I think it's very hard unless you have influence over the entire leadership, it's very hard for you to actually influence decision making in every single instance, because anytime a leader in a leadership council is proposing a position that might be viewed as a pro-Taliban statement, that person is perhaps being perceived as being under the influence of Pakistan. So I don't know exactly how that would obviously play out in the inner circles of the Taliban. It's the Taliban, unfortunately, after 20 years of war, continue to remain an enigma to most of us that are outside the movement. Returning to the issue of the Haqqanis, again, based on purely on my own personal opinions and speculation, the Haqqanis have become, as you mentioned, part and parcel of the Taliban movement. The leader of the Haqqani is a deputy of the Taliban, and they have been with the Taliban movement since the early days. The moment the Taliban movement in '94 entered the Pashtun belt beyond Greater Kandahar, the Haqqanis joined them, and they've never separated from them. So I find it difficult to imagine that the Haqqanis, for whatever reason, would decide to break away from the Taliban, unless their own personal interests or organizational interests were at stake. Where, for example, if the leader of the Haqqani was suddenly demoted from a deputy to a normal soldier, there's a much higher chance the Haqqanis would break away from the Taliban in that case than for any other power, external power or state. Again, I'm sorry, it's not a good answer. I don't have a lot of info on that, so just purely on my own personal opinion. Happy to hear from others as well.
No, nobody blames you for it, because frankly, we are all looking for answers out here, and none of us have all the answers given the kind of situation which exists in Afghanistan. But Kabir, this is the last question. We've already overextended our time. But Kriti did mention about the IS and their presence and the growing footprint at that insofar as Afghanistan is concerned. How much of a challenge do you see the IS for whatever happens next in Afghanistan, and how much do you think a lot of people, which is what I find strange, that a lot of people seem to think that the Taliban are the good guys and the IS are the bad guys. I don't know what's the difference in terms of brutality, in terms of the general attitude towards life. But a lot of people seem to think that bring in the Taliban to counter the IS, even though most of the guys who are in part of the IS have at one point or another, as Kriti said, been part of the Taliban movement, whether in Pakistan or in Afghanistan. But in your assessment, since you've been looking at this very closely, how much of a challenge do you think this is going forward? Kabir. Kabir, we can't hear you. Kabir, can you hear us?
Can you hear me? Am I?
Now I can.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I got parts of your question, so I'm just going to try and pick those up and answer. Look, even when the sort of IS Khorasan was coming up, it was residual, fighters from various sort of factions who found a very nice branded T-shirt to wear at that point of time. But it's I find it slightly, the whole notion of that the Taliban is fighting ISKP. Hence, there is available wiggle room for discussions, debate, and so on and so forth, to be quite frankly quite ridiculous. I mean, ISK is in the same position where the Taliban was before ISK existed. But I mean, the levels of brutality is a very subjective thing. Even shooting someone just standing in front of them is equally brutal if you do it in any other shape or form, if the person doesn't survive. So and I honestly, I'm very perplexed at times why this narrative has been brought up. I know Ambassador Khalilzad has also mentioned it once or twice in his often passing and bizarre narratives. But look, it's even if you see it from I think Afghan Analyst Network has done some good studies on geographical locations and control of what ISK holds technically in Afghanistan. It's very small. It's nothing big territorially compared to Afghanistan. Compared to the Taliban. If you see some of the latest maps that were released of what is under Taliban control and what is contested, and you compare that to the ISK, it's a bit of a bogey argument, to be honest. It's something that I think is marketable at this point of time from an American perspective as well. We need the Taliban. They're helping us destroy ISK, as if the ISK controls an immense amount of territory in northern Afghanistan and so on and so forth. So if you see that territorially at the moment, it's not that big a deal. The American airstrikes over the past year have diminished ISK a fair bit. So I think it's an argument of from an American perspective at least is of convenience at the moment, that we are dealing with the Taliban diplomatically and in other areas and giving them some sort of legitimacy or support in public opinion, specifically in the United States, may go not a long way, but at least some way while they are withdrawing. So beyond that, I really don't think it's a cognizant argument that deserves even 5 minutes of debate, that the Americans think the Taliban is a fruitful force to fight against IS. I mean, it's...
Yeah. Thanks, Kabir, and thank you, everyone. I thought we've had a reasonably good session. Thank you, Ambassador Sinha. Thank you, Ibraheem. Thank you, Kabir, Kriti, and Kalpit. I hope the people who are watching, thanks to you, but I hope you found it useful, this particular discussion going forward. We hope to hold similar discussions. We continue to do it on many other fields, but in some of the more depressing fields that people like Kriti, Kabir, and I deal with, we hope to have some more conversations around these issues going forward. So thank you everyone for signing in, and thanks a lot to all the panelists.